disturbing legends that time tried to erase to fall asleep to beneath the fog of early morning, when the Tower of London rises like a cathedral of shadows against the grey Thames. There are places where whispers linger long after lips have sealed themselves. Some stories do not announce themselves with drums or banners, but slip quietly into history, carried on the soles of servants' shoes, in the soft tap of a child's bare feet across cold stone. It is here, amid towers and walls that have witnessed both glory and betrayal, that the young lives vanished, leaving behind a silence heavier than any crown. Edward V, heir to the throne, and his younger brother Richard, once princes with velvet collars and bright eyes, were swallowed by a world that promised safety but delivered only shadow. It was England in the late 15th century, a realm teetering on the knife edge between wars of roses, where alliances twisted like ivy on battlements, and every corridor held both loyalty and threat. The tower was more than a fortress, it was a statement, a monument to authority and protection. Though its stones had long been acquainted with despair, into this ancient keep, Edward and Richard were placed under the watchful eyes of attendants and guardians, their daily laughter a fragile thread of innocence against the grinding machinery of politics. At first, the echoes of their play spilled through the corridors, carried by candlelight and the faint scent of wax and polished wood, but such light is fragile. Soon, laughter dimmed, and the halls grew longer, colder, as if the stones themselves had inhaled the children and refused to exhale. The shadows thickened over days, weeks, until even whispers dared not linger. Their uncle, Richard of Gloucester, moved with careful patience, cloaked in velvet courtesy and iron resolve. He soon assumed the throne, and with his ascent came a silence where voices had once been. The kingdom murmured, suspicion pooling in hushed corridors as rumors of smothered pillows, quiet blades, and clandestine commands slithered into every corner. Yet no bodies were ever produced, no confessions recorded. The tower held its secrets tight, the walls unwilling to speak the truths their mortar had observed. Centuries later, during routine maintenance beneath a stairwell, small skeletons were discovered, tiny remains that suggested youthful fragility, but certainly eluded the investigators. Were these the lost princes or nameless children claimed? By misfortune, coincidence, or disease, the discovery offered no closure. Only new questions layered atop the old, whispers echoing across generations. Unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, it is a story in which history itself seems complicit, where the pursuit of power devours innocence quietly, leaving only speculation and sorrow behind. There is a peculiar weight in imagining their last moments, the silence that replaced laughter, the chill that crept over velvet and bone alike. Perhaps they wandered the tower's corridors in those final hours, their small hands pressed to cold walls, seeking escape that never came. Perhaps they were aware of eyes watching, of destinies being rewritten by a man whose ambition outweighed mercy. Whatever the truth, it was stolen, not with the fanfare of battle, but with the quiet efficiency of history's indifference. Even now, centuries later, the tower does not forget. Ghosts are often said to linger, but here, even the stone remembers. Footsteps echo where none should tread, and shadows move with a hesitation that speaks of careful, unseen observation. The story of Edward and Richard is one of absence so profound it becomes presence and emptiness, that reverberates through every stone, through the bloodline and memory of a kingdom. It is a reminder that power is often cruel not in its spectacle, but in its silence, and that some questions will never find answers in daylight, only in the reflective hush of night. And so the princes remain beyond reach, suspended in a liminal space between life and legend. Their story is a lesson in the fragility of innocence when pressed against ambition, a meditation on the way history can erase the tenderest of lives, while maintaining its own narrative of inevitability. Somewhere within the labyrinth of the tower, somewhere between the echoing corridors and the rooms that know neither comfort nor escape, Edward and Richard slip beyond record. The world remembers only that they vanished, leaving a silence so absolute that it resonates still, a haunting refrain that asks, without reply, what becomes of those who disappear behind locked doors? Even as the wind whistles around the tower, and fog rises from the Thames like a shroud, their absence speaks with a voice more potent than any crown or scepter. In the hush before the kingdom exhales, in the breathless pause of history, there is an ache for the unfinished, a mourning for the lost, and the bitter knowledge that sometimes the greatest tragedies are those history itself chooses not to tell. Edward and Richard remain, suspended in time, whispers pressed into stone, memories of childhoods erased, yet remembered forever in the quiet spaces where power devours innocence and silence. Answers for the missing. The tower holds its memories like a dark manuscript written in stone, iron, and the faint impressions of small feet across cold floors. Servants spoke in whispers of fleeting glimpses, a shadow darting behind a curtain, the flutter of a sleeve, where no child should be, the soft click of a door that had no key. Candlelight flickered against the walls, throwing elongated shapes that seemed almost human, yet disappeared when approached. Guards claimed to hear soft murmurs at night, like half-formed sentences drifting across the halls. Some believed it was the restless breath of the boys themselves, trapped not only in the tower, but in the unrelenting machinery of history, their voices muted by fear, their futures stolen before they could be lived. Richard of Gloucester, now King Richard III, walked the corridors with the cool precision of a predator, each step measured, each glance calculated. Diplomats and nobles saw only a composed monarch, yet rumors circulated among the servants. Boys' cries silenced too abruptly, a game abruptly halted, doors locked from the inside without explanation. The tower became a place where innocence dissolved into suspicion, where corridors that should have echoed with laughter instead carried the weight of dread. Every stone seemed to absorb the tension, every shadow a reminder that the past could not be trusted to the present. It is said that even Richard's advisors felt the hush, the pressing absence, as if the kingdom itself knew something unspeakable had occurred behind the walls. They spoke carefully, aware that to utter certain truths could invite ruin, or worse become a permanent echo themselves. Stories of the boys' disappearance spread like smoke through London. But truth, as it so often does, fled the city faster than rumor could catch it. Some claimed they were smothered in their chambers, their cries cut short by servants loyal to ambition rather than conscience. Others whispered of starvation, or of secret burials in unmarked corners of the tower. Centuries later, when the skeletons were found beneath the staircase, scholars could not confirm their identities. DNA tests centuries later offered tantalizing hints, yet certainty remained elusive, as if history itself wished to preserve the mystery, to let the absence speak more profoundly than any evidence ever could. And so the tower's silence became a testament, not to cruelty alone, but to the fragility of youth in a world consumed by power. Edward and Richard remain eternal in their vanishing, their lives suspended between reality and legend, their absence a haunting reminder of how authority can erase what it cannot control. Their story teaches that the loudest horrors are sometimes those that go unheard, that the weight of history is often measured not in victories or defeats, but in the quiet erasure of those who cannot defend themselves. Even now, when the sun slants low across the ancient stone and mist curls along the battlements, one can almost feel the small presence of two boys who should have been princes. In every sense of the word, their laughter, now long silenced, lingers, faintly in the imagination, a fragile echo pressed into memory. And as night settles over the tower, as candlelight gutter and shadows lengthen, one is left with the ineffable sense of unfinished lives, of innocence stolen quietly, and of the stark, unanswerable question, what truly becomes of those who vanish behind locked doors, leaving only whispers, stone, and the relentless march of history to remember them? In Rome, where incense coils through vaulted ceilings like smoke through time itself, the sacred and the profane intertwine, and power is measured as much in ritual as in blood. The city of marble and shadows, of pontiffs and courtyards, has always been a place where the dead are not simply gone, they linger, whispered about in corridors where only the faithful dare tread. Yet, in the year 897, the dead did more than linger. They returned to speak, or at least to be forced into speech by the hands of the living. Pope Formosus, once clothed in white and crowned with the authority of Christ, was exhumed from his grave, his body carried through the streets to stand trial before a court that had no need of a witness. Who could respond? The dead, it seemed, could be accused, condemned, and punished, all in the name of ambition, vengeance, and fear. Formosus had died months before, leaving behind the papacy and a legacy of tenuous alliances and whispered secrets. Yet his corpse, stiffened and rotting, was summoned by Pope Stephen VI, a man whose motives remained veiled in the midst of political calculation and spiritual fanaticism. Draped in the Pope's vestments he had worn in life, Formosus was seated upon a throne, propped as if he were still capable of holding dominion over the living. The court proceeded with a macabre seriousness, addressing a man who could neither defend himself nor respond to accusation. The fingers of Formosus, brittle, and blackened, were counted and weighed as evidence. Every gesture of the corpse, every slumping inch of its flesh, became testimony against a life now claimed by God, and yet refused the dignity of rest. Accusations were hurled with the solemnity of ritual, that he had betrayed the church, that his papacy was invalid, that his choices threatened the authority of the present pontiff. When the judgment was pronounced, Formicus was declared guilty. His corpse was stripped of its garments, desecrated in the sunlight, and thrown into the Tiber, a river that carried both the water of Rome and the weight of divine ambiguity. The people of the city recoiled, yet some whispered that this was divine justice, that the dead had been held accountable for sins committed in life. Others feared that the spectacle itself, grotesque and unnatural, had invited calamity. In the months that followed, Pope Stephen VI met a fate that seemed to echo the macabre judgment he had enacted. He was found strangled in prison, his death abrupt and unexplained. The city murmured of vengeance human or divine, and the air grew thick with suspicion, as if the spirits of Rome itself had spoken through death. No records provided clarity, no confessions illuminated the shadows. The church sought to bury the episode in silence, erasing the grotesque trial as though it had never occurred. Yet the memory refused to vanish. Fishermen claimed the Tiber, spat back remnants of the body, the waters themselves unwilling to hide the truth. Formicus' trial, in its unsettling theater of death and accusation, is a story that transcends simple cruelty. It is a meditation on power, on fear, on the way institutions bend not only the living but the dead to their will. In Rome, the line between reverence and horror is thin, and here it was pierced completely. The Pope, who had died conveniently, became a symbol of uncertainty, a reminder that death does not always release us, and that sometimes the living will reach beyond the grave to preserve their own authority. Even today, the tale of the cadaver's synod haunts the mind, a cautionary echo that lingers in silent chapels, in the rustle of robes across cold stone, and in the knowledge that the most sacred of institutions can, under the right conditions, orchestrate a spectacle darker than any mortal imagination dared anticipate. In the warm, salting air of the Outer Banks, where the waves kiss the shore and the wind carries whispers from beyond the horizon, a story of disappearance lingers like driftwood in the sand. It is a tale not of conquest or slaughter, but of absence, quiet as fog and elusive as the morning tide. In 1587, a group of English settlers arrived on Roanoke Island, their hearts brimming with hope and ambition, their sails carrying the promise of a new beginning in a land untouched by their nation's old wars. They came to build homes, to plant fields, to shape a life that would flourish far from the crowned shadow. Yet fate, as it often does, demanded a darker path. The settlers constructed their dwellings with care, the wooden beams and thatched roofs standing as fragile monuments against the vast, untamed wilderness. Children laughed in the early evenings, chasing each other across sun-dappled clearings, while women tended gardens and men fell into routines of clearing land and forging alliances with the local tribes. For a time, the island held a semblance of peace, a fragile breathing space where European hopes brushed against native lands. But the colony existed under an unspoken tension. Supplies were scarce, the promise of resupply delayed by storms and misfortune, and whispers of the unknown crept in through the edges of the forest. Every rustle of leaves became a portent, every bird call a question that could not be answered. When Governor John White returned 3 years later, seeking the families he had left behind, he found the island emptied of its people. No bodies lay in the fields. No sign of struggle scarred the village. Only one word remained, carved into a post with the stark simplicity of a warning: Croatum. No cross of distress accompanied it, no plea or explanation. Children's toys lay abandoned where they had been left, meals half prepared and rotting in the sun, and homes stood eerily intact, like shells of a life abruptly vacated. The forest pressed close, dark and knowing, as if it had swallowed the settlers and kept them tucked within its shadowed depths. Was it disease, starvation, assimilation, or a deliberate vanishing meant to erase themselves from the record of European ambition? The answer, like mist over the marshes, refused to lift. Over the centuries, theories multiplied like waves upon the shore. Some spoke of the settlers joining neighboring tribes, learning their ways, disappearing into the natural world as though they had always belonged to it. Others whispered of darker fates, disease claimed silently, raids carried out under the cloak of night, or perhaps a collective decision to leave no trace for fear of the unknown. The truth remained suspended, half-formed, as fragile as the driftwood washed by tides that have long since reclaimed the sands, archaeologists have found fragment stools, arrowheads, hints of habitation, but never enough to tell a complete story. Every discovery is a whisper of the vanished, a reminder that human presence can dissolve so completely that even memory cannot fully retrieve it. Roanoke Island has endured as a cautionary ghost. Its tale is not of violent conquest, but of quiet erasure, a study in the fragility of human permanence. The settlers did not vanish amidst clamoring swords or the smoke of burning homes. They dissolved into the landscape itself, leaving behind a question that refuses to age. Can a community simply choose to disappear? The island, bound by tides and time, guards its secret with patience, the wind carrying the echo of absence, the low rustle of marsh grass speaking for those who were never heard. In that stillness, one feels the weight of human endeavor undone, the fragility of life rendered almost invisible, and a haunting knowledge that sometimes the most profound mysteries are those that announce themselves not in blood or fire, but in the quiet, deliberate silence of the vanished. In the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, where mountains rise like silent sentinels and valleys carry the weight of centuries, Frederick II ruled with a mind as sharp and unpredictable as the winter winds that swept across his lands, called stupor. Monday, the wonder of the world, he was both scholar and sovereign, a man whose intellect inspired awe and fear in equal measure. He spoke many tongues, wrote volumes of law, poetry, and astronomy, and yet, despite his brilliance, whispers of heresy clung to him like shadows. In the final years of his life, a different kind of murmur began, a dark, uneasy quiet that settled over his castles. Corridors once filled with debate and laughter now echoing only with uncertainty. Frederick II, the emperor who had commanded armies and courtiers alike, was said to sleep behind locked walls, confined not by illness alone, but by the invisible chains of fear and suspicion. The palace at Palermo, where he had spent much of his reign, became a fortress of silence. Windows barred, doors bolted from the inside, physicians and attendants sworn to secrecy. The emperor's final days were shrouded in mystery. Some claimed he suffered from a disease that no doctor could name. Others whispered of poison, administered with the precision of someone who understood that an emperor's death is never merely a matter of mortality, but of politics. His movements grew slow, deliberate, measured. He would linger over manuscripts, trace lines of geometry, and yet his eyes betrayed a growing awareness that his time was no longer entirely his own. Courtiers spoke in hushed tones, fearing that a single misstep in loyalty might invite his wrath or seal their own fate. When Frederick finally died in 1250, his body was laid to rest with ceremony, but rumors persisted like smoke clinging to stone. Some said he had been deliberately weakened, isolated to hasten the end. Others claimed he did not truly die at all, that the emperor had been hidden away, preserved from the world to prevent prophecy or unrest. Peasants swore that years later, at dusk, they saw a figure riding through the hills, the air carrying a faint scent of candle wax and ink, as if the man who had written laws and verses still traversed the land in secret. Perhaps it was imagination, the longing for a ruler who had shaped their lives with intellect and authority. Or perhaps it was the emperor himself, refusing to relinquish the world entirely. Frederick's death, real or imagined, left no simple closure. Enemies buried him, supporters mourned. History marched forward, yet legend lingered like fog over Sicilian hills, thick and persistent. The locked chambers, the barred windows, the sworn silence of attendants all became symbols of the delicate balance between power and fear, between knowledge and mortality. His life, so extraordinary and enigmatic, ended not with a triumphant coronation or a clear testament, but in a quiet mystery that grew heavier with time, a cautionary tale for those who would wield intellect and authority in equal measure. In remembering Frederick II, one contemplates not only his achievements, but the fragility of a life so deeply entwined with the ambitions and anxieties of others. The emperor who slept behind locked walls reminds us that even brilliance cannot escape the shadows cast by suspicion, that isolation can be both protection and punishment, and that history often leaves its most extraordinary figures suspended in ambiguity. Beneath the Sicilian stars, in the hush of the palace corridors and the whispering hills, his presence endures a quiet, lingering testament to the wonder, the fear, and the inexorable mystery that surrounded the last days of a ruler who seemed too vast, too brilliant, to be confined entirely to death. In the shadow of towering spires, where sunlight falls in fractured patterns across centuries-old stone. A secret lay hidden beneath the cathedral floor, waiting patiently for centuries to speak. The scent of incense clung stubbornly to the arches, mixing with the faint, lingering must of cold stone and earth, as if the very building remembered both devotion and despair. In a quiet corner of medieval Germany, a place meant to inspire, awe and reverence became a repository not only of faith, but of silence that carried a weight far heavier than any sermon. It was here, during careful renovations, that workers uncovered the fragile, disquieting remains of children, buried beneath the flagstones and chambers whose entrances had been lost to time. The skeletons were small, their bones delicate as the wings of moths trapped in amber. Some showed the hollowed evidence of malnutrition. Others bore the telltale signs of fractures, cruelly imposed or neglected. There were no markers, no inscriptions to indicate who these children had been, no prayers etched into the stone to guide their spirits. The cathedral, a place of life-affirming ritual and soaring song, had swallowed them, concealing the stories of youth abruptly severed. Local legends spoke in whispers of choir boys who misstepped in obedience, of small transgressions punished with cruel discretion, of tiny lives pressed into secrecy by those sworn to guide them. But the truth remained submerged beneath centuries of devotion, hidden in corridors and crypts that had borne witness to both devotion and terror. The silence surrounding the discovery grew heavier than the stone itself. Clergy denied knowledge. Archives had long been destroyed by fire or decay, and the community at large seemed hesitant to confront what had been buried both literally and metaphorically. Were these children victims of deliberate abuse, of sacrificial rites cloaked in the language of piety, or of the sweeping tide of plague that often claimed the most vulnerable first? Every theory carried its own weight of horror, and none could be proven. The floor was sealed again, bricks and mortar hiding the bones as carefully as time had, leaving the mystery to endure, pressing upon the imagination with a quiet insistence that refused to yield. Even today, one imagines the cathedral filled with the echo of tiny footsteps long silenced, the soft trill of young voices caught mid-song, drifting through the stone arches like smoke. Faith endures in the building, yet it shares space with questions that resist resolution. In contemplating these children, the observer is drawn into a meditation on absence, on lives ended before they could fully begin, and on the uncanny persistence of memory pressed into stone. The cathedral floor holds its secret not as punishment, but as testament that history is often written not in ink, but in silence, and that beneath even the most sacred places, shadows of the lost linger, reminding us that innocence can vanish quietly, leaving only the cold weight of absence and the haunting knowledge that some stories may never be told. Beneath the arches, where candlelight flickers and the air hangs thick with devotion, one can almost feel the weight of those small lives pressing upward from their hidden resting place. The floor above is worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims and clergy, each step a soft drumbeat over bones whose names were never spoken aloud. Perhaps the children were aware of their final confinement, sensing the cold embrace of stone walls closing around them, the muffled silence that would become their only witness. Or perhaps they slipped from the world unnoticed, swallowed by circumstance and fear, leaving only whispers that echo faintly in memory. The cathedral itself seems to remember, its stones imbued with both sanctity and sorrow. The centuries of prayers a pale veil over a deeper, more unsettling presence. The discovery of these remains stirred not only curiosity, but unease. Scholars and historians debated the origins of the children, yet every theory seemed to deepen the mystery. Were they victims of neglect, punished for the slightest misstep? Were they sacrificial offerings, hidden from public knowledge to preserve appearances of piety, or had disease claimed them quietly, and fear of scandal led caretakers to enter them in secrecy beneath the sacred floor? No record could confirm any of these possibilities, leaving the narrative suspended between speculation and silence. Even the church, which had long claimed authority over both life and death, seemed to recoil at the notion of confronting what lay beneath its most hallowed spaces. The stones had kept their secret well, and the living were left only with questions, their imaginations filling the gaps with shadows. As the centuries passed, the cathedral continued to function, hosting masses, weddings, and funerals, the sacred rhythm of life pressing on above the hidden chambers. Yet beneath, the children remained, their small skeletons an unspoken testament to the fragility of youth in an age of harsh discipline and rigid hierarchy. Their presence transforms the cathedral from a place of pure reverence to a threshold between devotion and darkness, where the human capacity for cruelty and neglect lingers alongside the pursuit of holiness. In this quiet interstice, one senses the echo of what was lost, the laughter that never reached the ears of the living, the games that ended before they could begin, the tender lives pressed into secrecy by forces larger than themselves. And so the cathedral endures, a monument not only to faith, but to memory, both preserved and denied. In its silence lies a meditation on absence and accountability, a reminder that the most profound stories are sometimes those that have no witnesses, and the most haunting truths are often hidden beneath the very ground we walk upon. The children, buried beneath the cathedral floor, remain unseen, yet their quiet presence presses upon the imagination, urging reflection on innocence, vulnerability, and the ways in which history conceals as much as it reveals. To walk within these walls is to feel the weight of time, and the subtle insistence of lives long vanished, reminding us that even within sacred spaces, shadows endure, carrying the unresolved fate of those who left the world too soon, and whose stories continue to resonate in the hush between stone and silence. In the remote hills of what is now northern Hungary, a castle rises from the earth like a jagged tooth against the sky, its dark silhouette etched against the horizon as if carved from shadow itself. Siege Castle, its stones weathered and blackened by centuries of rain and frost, seems to breathe a silent warning. Here, the line between legend and horror is so thin that the air itself trembles with its memory. Within its walls, history speaks not through chronicles or bells, but in the unsettling absence of voices, in corridors where no laughter lingers, and in rooms where light dares not dwell for long. It was here, centuries ago, that Elizabeth Bathory, Countess of Siege, carried out deeds that would haunt Europe long after her life ended. Deeds shrouded in secrecy, rumor, and political intrigue. Elizabeth was said to possess a beauty that drew the eyes irresistibly as her reputation drew fear. She was intelligent, proud, and relentless, ruling her estates with a hand both firm and unforgiving. Yet beneath this veneer of nobility, whispers began to gather, tales of young girls disappearing from nearby villages, their absence attributed to illness, misadventure, or the cruel whims of fate. It was only later, in the meticulous testimony of those few who dared speak, that the horror was suggested. Elizabeth, it was claimed, bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth, believing that the life force of the young could stave off decay, prolong her beauty, and keep the passage of time at bay. Trials were held, testimonies collected, yet even in the process, the truth remained elusive. Hundreds of names were suggested as victims, yet records contradict one another, some claiming far fewer, others far more. The political climate of the time was volatile, alliances shifting like mist over the Carpathians. Some historians argue that Elizabeth's reputation was inflated by her enemies, a convenient tool to seize her lands and diminish her influence. Regardless, her punishment was both dramatic and eerily silent. She was walled into her own chambers, sealed alive, left to perish without the presence of witnesses. Her suffering known only to the walls that imprisoned her. No crowds, no courts, no public execution, only stone and shadow as eternal companions. Within that silence, the castle itself seems to remember. It whispers of screams that could not escape, of footsteps that never returned, of lives consumed without acknowledgement. Visitors centuries later speak of a chill that rises without wind, of corridors where the darkness feels deliberate, almost sentient. The story of Elizabeth Bathory and her victims lingers not merely in the chronicles of crime, but in the imagination, pressing against the mind with the weight of what is unseen. What was concealed behind walls and silence? What was erased from memory even as it imprinted itself upon the landscape? In contemplating Siege Castle, one confronts a truth that stretches beyond individual cruelty. Power, when unchecked, can create spaces where life is rendered invisible, where suffering exists without acknowledgement, and where history itself becomes a participant in concealment. Elizabeth's chambers, sealed stone and silence, became a testament to that power, a chamber of memory and terror where death occurred quietly, deliberately, and without witnesses. Perhaps it was justice, or perhaps it was a cautionary tale that grew more terrifying with each telling. Today, the castle stands in ruin, but the walls retain their presence, dark and vigilant, a mute testament to lives lost behind them. In wandering its hallways, one imagines the soft patter of vanished footsteps, the whispers of the young who never returned, and the relentless pulse of history itself. Remembering what no one dared to see, Elizabeth Bathory remains both myth and memory, a figure whose deeds, whether amplified by fear, truth, or political expedience continued to cast shadows across centuries. The castle's stones, cold and unyielding, hold the echoes of those who suffered within, reminding all who enter that some horrors leave no record, and that silence can sometimes be the most terrifying witness of all. In the quiet cloisters of 12th century Italy, where morning light falls in slanting beams through narrow windows, a solitary monk walked the stone corridors with a presence that seemed both ethereal and urgent. He was of the Benedictine order, a man devoted to prayer, study, and the rhythm of the monastic day. Yet there was something about him that unsettled even those accustomed to the hushed solemnity of the abbey. Brother Anselm, or at least that is the name passed down through fragmented records, spoke often of visions, moments in which the veil between a mortal world and what lay beyond it seemed thin, almost tangible. In the pages of his personal writings, preserved only in fragments before the monastery was later consumed by fire, he recorded encounters with shadows, murmured warnings, and prophecies of events yet to come. Among these prophecies, one loomed larger than the rest. He foresaw his own death days before it occurred. He described it with meticulous, haunting detail of betrayal that would come not from strangers, but from those within the walls he had called sanctuary. The abbey, with its cloisters echoing the prayers of centuries, would witness the act, yet it would leave no witnesses willing to speak. The corridors that usually rang with soft chanting would remain still, a hush so absolute that the echo of a single step might have been enough to awaken the dead. Anselm's warnings, written in careful, deliberate script, were met with polite concern, dismissed as the imaginings of a devout man whose mind wandered too far into the spiritual. Yet those closest to him could not ignore the tension in his eyes, the way he lingered over corners, as if anticipating the unseen. When the moment came, the prophecy unfolded exactly as he had described. The monk was found slain, his body pale and still. In the very chamber where he had recorded his visions, there were no perpetrators caught, no sign of struggle beyond the subtle disturbance of a candle and the faint displacement of straw on the floor. The monastery, a place of discipline and order, seemed to close over the event like a tomb, hiding its truth from inquiry. Within weeks, his writings, those that had dared to reveal the shadowed future, vanished, leaving only fragments of the meticulous record. The monastery itself, decades later, would be engulfed by fire, consuming any remaining evidence of his prescience. Even now, centuries later, the story of Brother Anselm endures in whispers. Monks in subsequent generations spoke of corridors that carried a chill, of candles flickering without cause, of shadows that seemed to anticipate footsteps. The legend of the monk who predicted his own murder is not merely a tale of foreknowledge, but a meditation on the fragility of certainty, on the boundaries between the seen and unseen, and on the quiet persistence of fate in spaces that claim both the living and the dead. Anselm's death remains unrecorded in detail, yet in its absence, it speaks more loudly than any chronicle could, reminding us that some truths are preserved not in parchment, but in the hushed memory of stone, shadow, and the faint echo of a life that foresaw its own end. Along the windswept coast of the North Sea, where marshlands stretch like liquid mirrors and the horizon trembles under the weight of storm-laden clouds, there once existed a city that lived and died in a single breath of nature's fury. Rungholt, a medieval trading hub of the 14th century, was said to flourish with canals, bustling markets, and the laughter of children chasing each other along wooden docks. Its homes rose above the marsh, constructed with care and ambition, the people of Rungholt weaving a life in defiance of the restless tides. Yet the North Sea, patient and ancient, held its own memory of time, and in 1362, it demanded its reckoning in a way so swift and absolute that the city vanished. As though it had never been, Rungholt was celebrated for its prosperity and its skill in reclaiming land from the water, its dikes and embankments a testament to human ingenuity. Traders came from distant lands carrying goods, rumors, and alliances across rivers that cut like silver ribbons through the marshes. Life there was rhythmic, a measured cadence of labor, devotion, and fleeting joy. But the sea, ever watchful, had long been whispered about in local tales. Old men muttered of past storms, of villages swallowed and never returned, of the occasional bell ringing from beneath the waves, as if the drowned had not entirely relinquished the world of the living. Few paid heed to these murmurs, confident in their embankments and faith. Then came the storm of 1362, later called the Groot Mandriek, the great drowning of men. It swept across the coast with a fury unimagined, wind and water colliding in a symphony of ruin. Rungholt, so proud of its engineering and ambition, was overwhelmed almost instantly. Homes crumbled into mud and foam, streets disappeared beneath waves, and the people were claimed by the waters they had so long resisted. Survivors spoke of bells tolling beneath the waves for generations, of cries that drifted through the marshes in the nights following, as though the city itself remembered its own destruction. Maps of the region would later erase Rungholt almost entirely, leaving only vague notations, shadows of a once thriving hub swallowed by the sea. Centuries later, archaeologists and treasure hunters would uncover traces of streets, canals, and foundations beneath layers of mud and silt. Yet the full extent of the city and the lives lost within it remains unknowable, dissolved into memory and water alike. Local legend insists that Rungholt was punished, that moral corruption or hubris invited the sea's vengeance, but the truth is quieter, darker. Sometimes destruction arrives not as justice, but as the inexorable force of nature indifferent to human ambition. Rungholt endures in imagination, a city suspended between life and oblivion. It is a meditation on impermanence, on the fragile claim of humanity against the vast, patient rhythms of the world. The marshes whisper of its existence, the tides carry its memory, and beneath the waves, foundations slumber in silence, waiting to remind the living that even cities, like people, can vanish overnight without witnesses, without record, and without the mercy of remembrance. In the heat of the Levantine sun, where sand stretches like molten gold and the horizon shimmers with the haze of battle, a knight rode across the deserts of the Holy Land, bound by oath and faith. He had joined the Crusades, leaving behind the green hills of his homeland in Europe, a place of stone keeps, quiet villages, and hearth fires that promised warmth and comfort. For years, he fought alongside comrades, his sword cutting through both flesh and fear, each victory and defeat etched into the fabric of his being. Yet the war did not merely shape him, it unmade him, leaving traces of a world inverted, where visions of fire and ruin burned in reverse upon his mind. When he finally returned to his village, months after the last skirmish, the people noticed something unsettling. The man who had left so full of vigor now moved with a careful, almost unnatural deliberation. Sunlight seemed to recoil from him. Even in the brightest noon, his shadow refused to fall. Villagers stared, whispers curling like smoke around their cottages. A man without shadow, a soul separated from the natural order, a body that no longer obeyed the sun. He spoke little, his eyes haunted by visions he could neither explain nor fully remember. In his recounting, Jerusalem had burned not in the past, as history recorded, but backward, flames retreating, people vanishing from streets before the city itself succumbed to fire. His mind had carried the impossible, and perhaps, in some way, had been changed irrevocably by it. Days passed, and unease settled over the village like a fog. Crops that once flourished seemed dull in color, dogs whined without cause, and even the wind carried a hesitation, as though aware of a presence that belonged simultaneously to the world and not. The night refused sunlight, venturing only under the cover of dusk or within the shadows of buildings. His absence of shadow became a topic both feared and revered. Some whispered that he had glimpsed forbidden truths, that his body could no longer be tethered to the mortal plane, without betraying the visions it carried. Others claimed witchcraft, a curse that had struck him in the deserts far away, returning, him altered and incomplete. Weeks later, he vanished entirely. No footprints remained in the dirt, no trail marked his departure, and no one could say whether he had returned to the lands of battle, succumbed to the desert in spirit, or been claimed by forces invisible and deliberate. In records, he was marked dead, a casualty of time and neglect. Yet the villagers remembered him differently, a figure who moved without shadow, whose presence twisted the natural order, whose existence lingered at the edges of perception. The tale of the night became legend, told in whispers by firesides, in hushed prayers, in the careful avoidance of sunlight. In contemplating his story, one is drawn to questions of perception and reality, of what it means to survive a world too vast and violent to be fully contained by ordinary senses. The knight who returned without a shadow is a meditation on the fragility of human understanding, on the impossibility of carrying back truths too terrible for words, and on the haunting imprint one life can leave when it defies the ordinary patterns of nature. Shadows, after all, are the simplest measure of presence, yet he returned from distant lands, was proof that some experiences cleave so deeply to the soul that even the sun cannot illuminate them. In the silence left behind in the empty streets and whispered recountings, the village and perhaps the world still senses him, a figure caught forever between reality and the unseen, forever reminding us that some mysteries are meant not to be solved, but merely to be felt. In the cradle of civilization, where the Nile threads its silver through the sands and the city of Alexandria once rose as a beacon of human knowledge, there existed a library so vast that it seemed to hold the breath of the world itself. Scholars came from across lands and seas, bringing scrolls of philosophy, astronomy, medicine, and poetry. The Library of Alexandria was more than a building. It was a sanctuary of memory, a place where the accumulated thoughts of generations rested together in hushed reverence. Every scroll, every manuscript, every carefully inked character was a testament to humanity's desire to understand, to record, to endure. And yet, as with so much of what is precious, it was fragile, caught between the flame of ambition, the chaos of conquest, and the slow decay of neglect. The city itself bore witness to both wonder and catastrophe. The library's halls, filled with the scent of papyrus and the faint tang of ink, echoed with the voices of those who debated ideas that could reshape empires. Scholars moved like ghosts among its stacks, their fingers tracing lines of knowledge. Older than memory, their murmurs carried upward to domes that framed the sky. But outside the library, the world was less forgiving. Political turmoil, military conquest, and civil unrest pressed against the fragile walls, seeking to claim or destroy what they could not control. Historians dispute exactly when the first great destruction occurred. Some speak of Julius Caesar's siege of Alexandria, when fire consumed portions of the docks and perhaps the edges of the library's vast collections. Others claim that neglect and gradual decay, combined with later imperial ambitions, stripped the institution of its lifeblood over decades. Yet whatever the cause, the knowledge contained within was diminished, though fragments survived, passed from hand to hand, carried by scribes who fled, who copied, who hid what they could from both conqueror and time. And still, there was a second conflagration, a more subtle erasure, when records speak of decrees, invasions, and political decisions that ensured the remaining scrolls could not survive. The final breath of the library, whether through fire, flood, or systematic neglect, left humanity with whispers of what had been, hints of text that might have contained discoveries beyond our imagining, philosophies that could have rewritten ethics, histories that could have illuminated forgotten civilizations. Scholars still mourn the loss, yet no amount of speculation can reconstruct the fullness of the archive. The Library of Alexandria teaches that knowledge, no matter how sacred, is vulnerable to the forces of human ambition, error, and forgetfulness. It reminds us that civilizations rise and fall, not only through war and plague, but through the quiet erasure of memory. Today, we walk among ruins, sift through fragments, and imagine what was lost. Yet even in absence, the library endures not in scrolls or buildings, but in the idea itself that human curiosity, though impermanent, is relentless, and that the ache of lost knowledge continues to shape the way we understand the world. In its silence, it whispers a cautionary meditation that the pursuit of wisdom is both fragile and eternal, and that sometimes the greatest stories are those that vanished before they could be fully told. In the northern realms of Scandinavia, where winter winds carve hollows into mountains and frost turns every tree into a brittle skeleton, there reigned a king whose mind teetered on the edge of brilliance and madness. Eric XIV of Sweden, sovereign of crown and sword, carried the burdens of lineage and ambition like a blade at his temple, always aware that a king's power is as fragile as the trust of those who serve him. To his subjects, he was regal, learned, and capable. To his enemies, unpredictable, dangerous, and mercurial. Yet within the royal court, shadows lengthened faster than the light of day, and whispers grew into a chorus of dread. Eric's mind did not merely rule over his kingdom, it threatened to turn upon itself. In the autumn of his reign, paranoia seeped into every corner of his court. Courtiers were accused of treachery with the same ease as one might accuse the wind of stealing a candle's flame. Orders of imprisonment, banishment, and death flowed from his hand like ink from a scribe's quill, often without trial, often without reason beyond the whisper of suspicion. Yet there was one act so chilling in its audacity that it would haunt history. Eric, in a fit of delusion and frenzy, issued an execution order bearing his own name. It was not metaphor, nor a clerical error. The king had authorized the death of the man whose signature carried the weight of sovereignty himself. The court recoiled in terror. Advisors whispered that the king was possessed by a malign force, that his rational mind had been eclipsed by fear and rage. Clergy debated whether divine judgment had struck him, and yet the order remained official, a document stamped and sealed, existing in terrifying contradiction, a sovereign commanding his own end. In the days that followed, Eric's paranoia intensified, his behavior growing increasingly erratic. Men who once stood closest to him now feared the shadow of accusation, the swift edge of madness that could cut down even the king. Eventually, his reign ended not in ceremonial abdication, but in confinement and slow poisoning, or perhaps in deliberate starvation. Historians argue over the method, but all agree on the inevitability of his fall. Yet the image endures. A king so consumed by fear that he could issue death to his own self, a figure trapped between the inevitability of power and the fragility of human reason. In contemplating Eric XIV, one confronts the perilous intersection of authority and mental fragility, where absolute power magnifies every insecurity, and where the mind itself can become both executioner and victim. His life and the terror it wrought is a meditation on the way fear can distort justice, how ambition can corrode loyalty, and how history often preserves not the deeds of kings, but the echo of their unraveling. Even centuries later, the story carries a chill, a sovereign who might have slain himself through decree, whose paranoia consumed the court and poisoned the bonds of trust, whose name is forever linked to a grotesque form of self-destruct. Eric XIV reminds us that power is a mirror, fragile, reflective, and capable of fracturing, and in the quiet shadows of Sweden's royal past, one senses the lingering echo of a king whose mind turned inward with lethal precision, leaving behind a haunting meditation on the precariousness of life, authority, and sanity. In the heart of medieval Europe, where stone abbeys rose from misty hills and candlelight danced across stained glass windows, there existed a relic that defied both time and reason. A saint, long revered, had been entombed in a coffin of polished oak and iron, the body prepared according to ritual, washed in oils, wrapped in linen, and blessed with prayers meant to carry the soul to heaven. Yet when the tomb was opened weeks later, then months, and even years beyond, those who gazed upon it were struck with awe and unease. The saint's flesh remained unspoiled, the features serene, untouched by decay. Scholars, clergy, and peasants alike whispered that here was a miracle, a divine testament to sanctity, proof that holiness could resist the natural laws that claimed all else. The abbey became a place of pilgrimage, drawing crowds who came to see the incorrupt body, to touch the coffin in hope and wonder, to kneel before a presence that seemed suspended between life and death. The air within the walls held a palpable tension, a mingling of incense, devotion, and awe. Candles burned constantly, their flames reflected in the polished surfaces of reliquaries, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward eternity itself. The saint's visage remained calm, untouched by worm or rot, a silent reminder that the mortal realm could not entirely claim the sacred. Pilgrims left offerings, prayers, and tears, while the monks recorded accounts of inexplicable preservation, with reverence and fear, aware that some mysteries were not meant to be fully understood. Yet the miraculous calm did not endure. Political tides shifted, rivalries between clergy, nobles, and kingdoms spilled into the abbey's quiet halls. As power changed hands, the incorrupt relic became a tool, its miracle questioned, its sanctity politicized. One night, records claim, the body was found altered, decay appearing suddenly, overnight, as if time itself had been allowed to reclaim what it had previously been denied. Scholars and faithful alike were horrified, the miracle undone not by nature alone, but perhaps by human intervention, jealousy, or the delicate manipulation of belief. Was it divine retribution, or the hand of men seeking to rewrite history? The truth vanished amidst speculation, leaving only unease and wonder. The story of the relic is more than a tale of preservation or decay. It is a meditation on impermanence, on the fragility of faith when confronted by human ambition, and on the thin veil between the sacred and the profane. Even in its ruined or corrupted state, it whispers across centuries, reminding us that the extraordinary may persist only as long as belief, that miracles are fragile in a world ruled by politics and mortality, and that some truths, like the saint's body itself, may resist comprehension, only to surrender again to the inexorable flow of time. In contemplating the relic that refused to decay, one feels the weight of mortality, the fleeting nature of human certainty, and the haunting beauty of a mystery suspended between devotion and the inevitable decay that governs all things. In the rugged heartlands of medieval Europe, where villages huddled beneath the shadow of stone castles and the wind carried the scent of forest and smoke, there unfolded a trial unlike any other, a trial not for the living, but for the dead. A peasant revolt had shaken the region, a surge of desperation and defiance that challenged the rigid order of lords and monarchs. The uprising was quashed swiftly, violently, and with little mercy. Leaders were executed, villages punished, and the survivors left to rebuild lives shadowed by fear. Yet even in victory, the powers that be found reason to extend their reach beyond the grave, to assert dominion over memory itself, and to strike terror into the hearts of those still breathing. Years later, as if the dead might still answer for their crimes, the authorities convened a trial not against survivors, but against the skull of the revolt's leader. Long interred beneath soil and secrecy, the bones were exhumed, placed upon a tribunal like a witness or defendant, and subjected to scrutiny that combined ritual, superstition, and the nascent forms of legal procedure. Clerks recorded accusations against a man who could no longer speak. Judges debated what his actions might have meant, and witnesses offered testimony about events they had never observed. Relying instead upon hearsay, rumor, and fear, the tribunal proceeded with solemnity, as if the presence of the bones themselves demanded recognition, as if justice could be imposed posthumously, and as if the dead could be made to answer for sins that the living could not fully comprehend. The outcome was as chilling as it was symbolic. The leader was condemned. The sentence was carried out not in violence, for the body could not be punished again, but through ritual erasure, land confiscated, records altered, memory bent toward the will of the powerful. The bones were reburied in silence, their authority broken, the revolt itself rewritten as a cautionary tale. The village remembered, in quiet whispers, that even the dead could be judged, that history could be bent against those who had no voice, and that power extended beyond life, into the very soil where corpses lay. This trial stands as a haunting meditation on authority, memory, and injustice. It is a reminder that human societies have long sought control not merely over the living, but over the stories of the departed, shaping narratives to suit fear and ambition. In the stillness of the fields where the revolt once raged, one can almost sense the echo of bones that were dragged into judgment, the silent plea of those denied the finality of rest, and the unsettling truth that sometimes the most terrifying verdicts are those rendered in absence against those who cannot defend themselves. The trial of the innocent dead endures in legend, a caution whispered across centuries about the fragile boundary between justice and cruelty, between life and the relentless claim of authority over memory. In a quiet European city of the 13th century, where cobblestone streets twisted like labyrinthine veins and the bells of the cathedral tolled with solemn insistence, a bishop prepared for a grand procession. It was a day of ritual and reverence, the clergy clad in embroidered vestments, incense rising in curling tendrils that filled the air with the sacred scent of myrrh and wax. Citizens lined the streets, anticipation heavy in their breath, for the bishop was a man of renown, his influence extending beyond the city walls, his counsel sought by kings and nobles alike. Yet on this particular day, beneath the bright light of a waning sun, the ordinary rhythm of devotion would be broken by an event so inexplicable that it would haunt chronicles, whispers, and memory for centuries. The procession moved slowly through the streets, banners fluttering like living shadows, priests and acolytes chanting hymns that resonated against stone facades. The bishop, a tall figure with a stern yet compassionate face, led the march with dignity, his mitre casting a long shadow across the stones. And then, in a moment so quiet that only the shifting of air betrayed it, he vanished. One instant he was there, his hands raised in blessing, and the next, nothing remained but the echo of footsteps and the rustle of robes. Witnesses frozen, disbelief, eyes straining along the route for a glimpse, a trick of the light, some hint of his presence, but he was gone. The ground bore no mark of disturbance, no hidden trap, no misstep that could account for his disappearance. Those closest to him reported a sense of absence before realization, a subtle void that the soul seemed to notice before the body, a feeling that the world itself had swallowed him whole. Searches were immediate and exhaustive. Clergy scoured the cathedral, hidden chambers, crypts, and cellars. Townsfolk combed the streets, alleys, and surrounding forests. Yet nothing emerged, no body, no sign, no clue. Rumors took shape quickly. some whispered of divine intervention, that the bishop had been taken to heaven mid-prayer. Others muttered darker fates of enemies and conspiracies cloaked in ecclesiastical shadow. Over time, the official record grew sparse, reduced to brief notations in dusty ledgers, as if those in power sought to erase the anomaly, to restore order by refusing to acknowledge disorder. The bishop's name survived, but the man himself, present one heartbeat and gone the next, became legend, a figure suspended between the mortal and the impossible. In contemplating this event, one is drawn into the fragile boundary between faith, power, and the unexplained. The bishop who vanished mid-procession is not merely a story of disappearance, but a meditation on the impermanence of presence, the limits of observation, and the quiet ways the world reminds us of its mysteries. Stone walls, incense smoke, and solemn hymns still linger in memory, yet the bishop's absence endures as the most profound element, teaching that sometimes history carries not only the record of deeds, but the weight of what cannot be explained. In the echo of empty streets, the hush of the cathedral, and the whispered retellings of citizens, one senses the persistence of a truth beyond comprehension, that a life, even one devoted to guiding others, may vanish entirely, leaving only silence and wonder in its wake. High among the jagged peaks of the Alps, where wind whips like steel across sheer cliffs and clouds cling to stone like shrouds, there exists a fortress that seems to defy both time and purpose. Its walls rise abruptly from the crags, a monolith of gray rock and shadow, as if the mountain itself had decided to hide something within. Though centuries have passed, the fortress whispers of silence, secrecy, and deliberate absence. Historians can piece together fragments of its origin built by a minor lord, seeking strategic dominance, expanded by subsequent rulers, but the truth of its purpose remains elusive, concealed behind walls designed not only to repel intruders, but to bury knowledge itself. Within the fortress, the corridors wind in deliberate confusion. Staircases spiral without apparent logic, and chambers are sealed with heavy iron doors that show no sign of recent use. There are no records of soldiers garrisoned within its walls, no accounts of battles fought from its battlements, and no inventories of supplies sufficient to sustain even a handful of men. Yet local legends insist that prisoners were held there, names and faces erased from memory, their existence confined to the shadows of the stone. Some whisper that these were political dissidents, others that they were alchemists, seers, or men who had glimpsed secrets too dangerous to survive. The fortress, perched above the clouds, was both shield and tomb, a place where power could be exercised without scrutiny, and where those deemed inconvenient could vanish, as though swallowed by the mountain itself. Travelers and cartographers over the centuries have noted the eerie emptiness of the site. Attempts to explore the fortress are met with cold stone, doors that will not budge, and corridors that lead only to blank walls. The surrounding villages tell tales of lights flickering in sealed chambers, of voices carried down the cliffs at night, and of shadows moving against the wind. No evidence of bodies or records has ever been recovered, as though the mountain itself conspired with its builders to ensure total erasure. Scholars speculate endlessly what secrets were so dangerous that they required the complicity of stone, isolation, and silence. Who were the captives? And what knowledge did they carry that history was compelled to forget? In standing before the fortress today, one feels the weight of absence pressing outward, the deliberate void left by human hands and stone alike. It is a meditation on secrecy, on the fragility of memory, and on the unsettling truth that some histories exist only to be concealed. The fortress holds nothing yet contains everything, the echoes of lives hidden, the murmurs of forbidden knowledge, the shadow of fear etched into its walls. It teaches that power often operates not in spectacle, but in quiet suppression, and that the most enduring secrets are those that refuse to be recorded, leaving only stone and shadow to bear witness. Among the peaks and mist, the fortress endures a silent sentinel of what we may never know, a reminder that some truths are buried so deeply that even time cannot coax them into light. In the opulent courts of medieval Europe, where gilded tapestries hung heavy on stone walls and the scent of incense mingled with the copper tang of blood from distant battles, a royal wedding was meant to mark the union of power, lineage, and alliance. The halls were alive with music, the clatter of servants, and the polite murmur of nobles whose eyes measured both wealth and ambition. Yet beneath the glittering celebration, a shadow gathered a darkness that would transform the ceremony from a promise of prosperity into a haunting enigma. For the bride, a queen by marriage and ambition, would never emerge from her chambers in the same way. Her marriage, celebrated with fanfare, ended in silence, a confinement so absolute that even chroniclers struggled to recount it without hesitation. The young queen, radiant in silk and jewels, entered the bedchambers prepared to meet her husband for the first time as his wife. The room was adorned with candles, draped in velvet, perfumed with oils meant to inspire intimacy and awe. Yet when attendants returned the next morning, the doors were locked from within. No cries, no footsteps, no sign of presence could be discerned. Weeks passed, then months. The queen was seen only through rare glimpses from barred windows or reports filtered through loyal servants who dared not speak too plainly. Chroniclers offer conflicting accounts. Some suggest illness, perhaps sudden and severe. Others hint at scandal, whispers of a bride's silence for her defiance or threatened by courtly intrigue. The truth, as is often the case, was swallowed by the thick stone walls and the fearful discretion of those who served both crown and secret. The king, for his part, moved through the halls with practiced decorum, his public persona unshaken by the absence of his bride. The court speculated, in hushed tones, careful to avoid the sharp edge of accusation. Diplomats and nobles exchanged glances heavy with conjecture, yet letters and records remained cryptic, omitting the fate of the queen entirely. Over time, the bedchamber itself became a symbol, a silent sentinel of power, control, and fear, a place where a person could be present yet absent, seen yet unreachable, alive yet erased from public life. The queen's confinement challenged the very assumptions of marriage, sovereignty, and the boundaries of authority. Centuries later, historians still debate the nature of her isolation. Was it illness, political maneuvering, or an intentional erasure designed to maintain appearances and secure dynastic interests? Whatever the cause, the queen's experience resonates as a meditation on power and absence, on the way human lives can be contained within walls that preserve secrets more enduringly than any document. Her story teaches that authority often hides behind ritual and expectation, that silence can be more compelling than proclamation, and that sometimes the most profound tragedies unfold not in public spectacle, but in rooms where doors are locked and voices are denied. The royal marriage that ended in locked silence is remembered not for celebration, but for the quiet, suffocating weight of confinement, and for the haunting knowledge that even within the gilded cages of royalty, life can be rendered invisible, leaving only shadows and the echo of what might have been. Nestled in a valley where mist drifts like whispered secrets between hills, there once thrived a village whose existence seemed as old as the stones upon which its homes were built. The streets wound in careful irregularity, reflecting centuries of habitation, and the timbered houses bore the marks of countless generations. Life there moved slowly, measured by the turning of seasons and the tolling of the church bell. Yet beneath the apparent serenity, a shadow gathered, one that would not only consume the present, but erase the past entirely. For in a single, deliberate act, the village chose to murder its own history, burning archives, documents, and records that might have told the story of its people for centuries. The impetus for this obliteration is shrouded in mystery. Some chronicles, fragmented and scarce, hint at a catastrophic event, a plague that reduced families to mourning, a massacre that left survivors too terrified to speak, or an internal conflict that had torn the community apart. Others suggest darker motives: political intrigue, the fear of reprisal from higher powers, or the desire to conceal deeds too shameful to withstand the scrutiny of time. Whatever the cause, the villagers acted with chilling unanimity. Fires were lit in the town square, archives hurled into flames, ledgers burned alongside letters, and any object that could recall the past was consigned to ash. The smoke rose in curling tendrils, as if the valley itself mourned the destruction of memory, and the air became heavy with both soot and the invisible weight of stories forever lost. Survivors offered no explanation, at least none that endured. When travelers asked, they received only silence or vague gestures, averted eyes, and whispered warnings. Some histories are too dangerous to preserve, they said, and some truths too volatile to endure. Over time, the village adapted, rebuilding houses and streets as though the fire had cleansed not only the past, but the present, leaving only the necessity of survival. Yet beneath the new facades, the absence of history was palpable. Festivals, lineages, and communal rituals became fragmented, unmoored from the depth of memory, a society aware that what was lost could never be recovered. In contemplating this act, one recognizes the deliberate violence done not to bodies, but to memory. the way human societies can obliterate themselves as thoroughly as any external force might. The village that murdered its own history reminds us that preservation is fragile, that the past requires witnesses, and that fear, shame, or despair can drive even entire communities to erase themselves from time. The smoke of those long-ago fires lingers metaphorically, a warning that memory is both sacred and vulnerable, and that the most haunting tragedies sometimes unfold not in death, but in the annihilation of the stories that define us. The valley remains, silent and misladen, a monument to absence, whispering of lives, deeds, and truths that were deliberately consigned to shadow in the halls of medieval Europe, where throne rooms gleamed with gilded splendor and tapestries depicted victories long past. There existed a crown whose history was more shadow than light. It was a ceremonial piece, crafted with gold, jewels, and delicate filigree, meant to symbolize the continuity of power, the legitimacy of rule, and the divine sanction of monarchy. Yet the crown carried a darker legacy, a whisper of death that clung to its metal as persistently as dust. Those who wore it often did not survive long to reap the authority it conferred. 3 kings, all consecrated and adorned by this very diadem, perished within the span of a single year, leaving courtiers and chroniclers to murmur of curses, poison, or divine retribution. The first king to fall beneath its shadow was a man, known for his ambition, whose every action seemed guided by the promise of conquest and the hunger for legacy. His coronation was a spectacle, a festival of gold, banners, and prayers, the crown itself resting lightly upon his head. Within weeks, illness struck. Some whispered poison, others suspected the ire of God or fate. Chroniclers, careful to avoid accusation, merely noted the suddenness of his decline and the uncanny timing with the crowning ceremony. The second king, who succeeded him, bore the crown with both reverence and dread, aware of the whispered legend yet unable to refuse its weight. His reign, though brief, was marked by fear and instability, as advisors and enemies alike recoiled from the ominous precedent. Within months, he too was dead, the cause unclear, though suspicions of assassination, poisoned wine, and conspiracies abounded. The crown, once a symbol of authority, had become a talisman of doom. By the time the third king ascended, wearing the cursed diadem, fear had settled into the stones of the castle itself. Courtiers avoided the coronation hall, priests muttered prayers to avert misfortune, and astrologers consulted the heavens for warning. Yet the cycle could not be broken. Within the year, he too was gone, and the crown was removed from use, sequestered in a vault where sunlight could not touch it, where only silence and shadow kept its deadly history. The tale of the crown that killed 3 kings endures as a meditation on the fragility of power, the intersection of superstition and politics, and the human inclination to seek patterns in the wake of tragedy. Whether cursed by design, fate, or coincidence, the crown reminds us that symbols, while meant to convey authority and continuity, can also carry the weight of fear, mortality, and the unknowable forces that shape history. Its legacy is not merely in gold and jewels, but in the lingering unease of those who understood that some objects, like some truths, hold more than mere decoration. They bear the weight of death and the echo of lives extinguished. Under their shadow, along the winding roads of medieval Europe, where forests pressed close on both sides and the sun pierced the canopy in golden shafts, a group of pilgrims set forth toward Rome. They carried staffs, satchels, and hearts brimming with devotion, leaving behind villages wrapped in mist and small churches that had been their earliest teachers of faith. Their journey was meant to be sacred, to reach the eternal city, to offer prayers at the altars of saints, and to witness the grandeur of a civilization steeped in devotion. Yet the pilgrimage would end not in triumph, but in disappearance, leaving only whispered warnings and empty paths where feet had once pressed. The pilgrims moved in orderly procession, chanting hymns that carried softly through the trees, their voices blending with the rustle of leaves and the distant cry of birds. Days passed, and travelers encountered them along rivers, fords, and crossroads, noting their piety, their determination, and the serene cadence of their march. But as the weeks stretched on, those who followed the roads observed a growing unease. The pilgrims' numbers seemed to thin. Without explanation, some assumed they had taken side paths to rest, others feared illness. But no one dared to interfere directly, for pilgrims were sacred in the eyes of the faithful, and to question their journey was to court divine displeasure. When the roads leading into Italy were finally scattered months later, no group of pilgrims could be found. Their staffs, once upright and steady, were left leaning against trees along the way. Their cloaks were folded neatly upon the banks of streams, as if the travelers had vanished mid-step. Villagers and local authorities searched tirelessly, combed the forests and questioned shepherds, yet no bodies, no tracks, no signs of struggle appeared. Theories arose: bandits, disease, supernatural intervention, or a voluntary merging with isolated communities to escape worldly burdens. One chronicler suggested that the pilgrims had been guided by divine hands into hidden paths, disappearing into realms known only to God. Another whispered that some malevolent force had claimed them, teaching fear through absence rather than spectacle. The mystery endures in legend, carried in the voices of storytellers and the cautionary prayers of those who dared to journey far from home. The pilgrims who never reached Rome remind us that devotion does not always ensure safety, that paths believed sacred can be swallowed by uncertainty, and that absence can speak as loudly as presence. In empty forests, where staffs lean against the gnarled roots of ancient trees and streams run over stones polished by time, one senses the echo of their vanished journey in meditation on faith, impermanence, and the fragile thread that connects the living to the promised horizon of belief. Beneath the uneven streets of a medieval city, where markets buzzed with the barter of grain and the clatter of hooves echoed against cobblestones, there existed a dungeon that defied reason and expectation. It was not known to the common townsfolk, for the entrance had been sealed centuries earlier. Swallowed by renovations, neglect, and deliberate erasure, the dungeon had no doors, no visible entrance, and no account in surviving city records. Yet when laborers uncovered its vaulted stone chamber during construction, they found the remnants of lives long forgotten, a silent testimony to imprisonment that had eluded history itself. The room was cold, damp, and cloaked in shadows that seemed to cling to the walls like living things. Stalactites had formed along the ceiling, dripping into puddles that reflected the dim light of torches. Bones lay scattered across the floor, some complete, others broken or gnawed by time. Rusted shackles remained fixed to the walls, their iron cold and unyielding, as though mocking the passage of centuries. There were no inscriptions, no records, no hints of who had been confined within these walls, or for what crime. Every artifact, every fragment, carried only the weight of absence, the testimony of human suffering rendered invisible by design. Historians speculate endlessly: were these political prisoners, whose existence had been intentionally erased, victims of religious persecution, accused of heresy or sorcery and deliberately forgotten to prevent martyrdom? Or perhaps they were enemies of the crown, seized and confined beyond the reach of law, their stories extinguished so completely that even memory could not sustain them. The very architecture of the dungeon suggests intentional design, not merely to contain, but to erase, to ensure that those imprisoned were invisible both in life and in death. No door, no entry, no exit, only stone, shadow, and silence. In the decades following its rediscovery, the dungeon became a place of awe and dread. Scholars descended with lanterns, recording bones, chains, and chambers with meticulous care. Yet the mystery only deepened. Who had built it? How were the prisoners placed within? How long had they endured before succumbing to hunger, disease, or despair? And most hauntingly, why had the existence of this subterranean chamber been erased so thoroughly from every chronicle, every legal document, every map? The dungeon without doors teaches that absence can be as profound as presence, that confinement can extend beyond walls into the erasure of memory. It is a meditation on human cruelty, secrecy, and the limits of knowledge. The walls themselves seem to whisper, as if demanding recognition, imploring witnesses to acknowledge the lives consigned to shadow. One cannot help but feel the weight of those lost souls, pressing silently from beneath stone and mortar, reminding us that some atrocities leave no trace, yet speak to us with the enduring power of absence. In that echoing silence, we confront the unsettling truth that history is as much what is hidden as what is revealed, and as sometimes the most chilling prisons are those that exist beyond doors, beyond light, and beyond memory. In the sprawling courts of the Byzantine Empire, where gold mosaics glimmered in candlelight and the scent of incense mingled with the distant tang of the sea, there lived an empress whose presence was both commanding and elusive. She ruled not merely as consort, but as sovereign in her own right, her intellect and ambition shaping policy, diplomacy, and the intricate web of court intrigue. Yet history would betray her not through death, nor by exile, but by erasure. For in the surviving records, she seemed to vanish, her authority stripped from chronicles while she remained very much alive, her rule continuing in secret, obscured by the deliberate choices of scribes, rivals, and historians who found her inconvenient. Her disappearance from records was gradual, subtle, and chilling in its precision. Coins ceased to bear her likeness, official decrees omitted her signature, and chroniclers who once described her counsel and counsel now wrote, as though she had never existed. Courtiers whispered in corridors, unsure whether to address her in public or treat her as a ghost walking among them. Foreign emissaries noticed inconsistencies, letters signed by the emperor alone, announcements of policies implemented without acknowledgement of the empress's hand. Yet in private chambers, her influence was palpable, decisions traced back to her mind, strategies crafted by her insight, and the empire's fortune shaped in quiet collaboration. Historians debate the cause of her erasure. Some suggest political maneuvering, the result of factions seeking to minimize her power in the eyes of posterity. Others claim religious pressure or misogynistic bias, the deliberate dismissal of a woman's sovereignty from the official narrative. Regardless of the motive, the empress endured, a sovereign without recognition, ruling while her existence was rewritten as absence. To contemporaries, this paradox was terrifying, a figure alive, commanding, and consequential, yet invisible to the ledger of memory, her life and authority mediated through omission. The phenomenon raises haunting questions about the nature of history itself: who controls the record, whose stories are preserved, and whose lives are condemned to shadow despite continued influence. The Empress, who was written out alive, reminds us that power is not only exercised through force or counsel, but through the manipulation of memory. Her life becomes a meditation on survival and silence, on the fragile line between presence and erasure, and on the way human ambition can extend beyond life, shaping the narrative itself. Even today, the faint trace of her legacy lingers in architecture, policy, and whispers in manuscripts, a testament to resilience, the enduring weight of authority, and the unsettling truth that one can exist fully yet remain officially invisible. In the dark heart of a medieval city, where the castle towers loom like silent sentinels over narrow, winding streets, there was an execution that would confound history for centuries. A nobleman, accused of treason and sedition, was dragged from his private chambers and brought before the assembled populace. The air was thick with incense, fear, and the heavy musk of anticipation. The crowd's murmurs swelled into chants demanding justice. Judges, robed in black and crimson, intoned the charges with solemnity, while the executioner, hooded and silent, readied the instruments of death. Yet what followed defied expectation, though the sentence was pronounced and carried out in full ceremonial fashion. No body remained. The public spectacle proceeded with every ritual observed. The condemned man was led to the scaffold, his hands bound, his expression calm yet resigned. Witnesses swore they heard the fatal blow, the finality of a life ended by law. The crowd gasped, some fainted, and priests muttered prayers for the soul of the departed. When the bodies of executed traitors were customarily displayed or buried, however, this man was nowhere to be found. The scaffold was inspected, the ropes and blades examined, but the corpse had vanished, leaving only silence and the lingering scent of iron in the air. Officials offered no explanation, and rumors immediately began to circulate, fueled by fear and speculation. Some claimed that he had been spirited away by allies, smuggled through hidden tunnels known only to the nobility. Others whispered darker possibilities, that the king had sought to erase him completely, leaving no trace for history to remember, or that sorcery had been involved, a spell or ritual that allowed a life to be extinguished in presence yet absent in remains. Chroniclers, wary of angering the crown, recorded only the bare facts, creating a gap in the historical record that would invite centuries of conjecture. The execution that left no corpse resonates as a meditation on power, fear, and the limits of observation. It reminds us that justice is not always witnessed, that authority can manipulate not only life but memory, and that the absence of evidence can weigh more heavily than any visible act. In the quiet corners of the city, where the scaffold once stood and the crowd dispersed into whispering streets, one can imagine the ghostly echo of that vanished nobleman. His death was performed, witnessed, and yet denied corporeal proof, leaving behind only the haunting awareness that history itself can be manipulated, and that some endings, however public, remain suspended between reality and legend. In a remote corner of medieval Europe, nestled between fog-laden forests and rolling hills that whispered with the voices of centuries, stood an abbey where the sacred and the uncanny intertwined so completely. That sleep became a stranger to its inhabitants. Monks arrived in solemn procession, robes brushing stone floors, sandals echoing in the silent cloisters, carrying only books, candles, and the promise of devotion. The abbey was meant to be a place of prayer, meditation, and rest, a refuge from the chaos of the outside world. Yet, for decades, the brothers who lived within its walls could not rest. Night after night, voices rose from the shadows, a symphony of murmurs, cries, and unintelligible whispers that no human mouth could produce. At first, the monks believed the sounds were natural, the groan of timber, the wind through the eaves, the distant howl of wolves. But as days turned to weeks and weeks to months, it became impossible to dismiss. The noises followed the rhythm of their lives, growing louder during prayer, echoing in the stone corridors at midnight, sometimes responding to the monks' own words with a mocking cadence. Candles would flicker and die without reason. Objects would shift, subtly at first, then with undeniable force. Sleep became a fleeting dream, stolen in stolen moments beneath the shadow of stone arches, until the abbey itself seemed alive, awake in its own dark consciousness, mocking the devotions of its residents. Chroniclers who recorded these events wrote of exhaustion, despair, and madness. Monks fell ill from fatigue, some muttered of curses or divine punishment, while others suggested the abbey's foundation had been laid upon soil that remembered old sins. The echoes of prior generations' crimes resonating through time. Attempts to leave were thwarted by storms, hostile neighbors, and impassable roads. Visitors who entered the abbey reported the same phenomena: cold drafts carrying whispers, shadows moving against candlelight, a persistent feeling of being observed by eyes that could not be seen. Eventually, the abbey was abandoned. The remaining monks fled silently, leaving behind their manuscripts, vestments, and prayers, and the building fell into ruin. Yet the stories endured. Travelers reported strange lights in the windows, the sound of chanting without source, and the sense of unrest that lingered in the stones. The abbey where no one slept stands as a meditation on isolation, the persistence of memory, and the thin veil between devotion and torment. It teaches that even sacred spaces are vulnerable to forces beyond comprehension, and that silence, or the lack thereof, can shape the mind as surely as the hand of man. In the wind through the empty cloisters and the shadows among the broken arches, one can still sense the haunting rhythm of voices that never rested, a reminder that some places hold their own consciousness, and some mysteries endure long after humanity has fled. In a kingdom framed by jagged mountains and rivers that cut through misted valleys, like silver knives, a king ruled whose voice had commanded armies, counseled nobles, and instilled both fear and reverence in equal measure. His death, when it came, was expected to silence him completely, a natural conclusion to the cadence of authority. But history, as it often does, refused to follow the ordinary path. 4 years after his passing, a sealed letter surfaced, its edges yellowed by time, bearing the royal seal that had once been pressed into decrees and proclamations. The message was unmistakably his oar, so the witnesses insist today, and its contents carried instructions, warnings, and counsel that none alive could have authored. The king had spoken after death, leaving both awe and terror in his wake. The letter arrived quietly, first in the hands of the chancellor, then disseminated through a circle of nobles sworn to secrecy. It bore not only the king's seal, but also a precise articulation of political maneuvers, alliances, and judgments, some of which had immediate and tangible effects on the governance of the realm. Historians and scribes of the era debated its authenticity, torn between reverence and skepticism. Could a man, dead and entombed, have prepared such meticulous directives? Timed to arrive after his death? Some whispered of prophetic foresight, the ability to plan with the certainty of fate itself. Others muttered of trickery, forged documents, or the subtle manipulation of loyal courtiers seeking to shape events. Under the guise of posthumous instruction, the effect on the kingdom was profound. Laws were enacted, lands redistributed, and enemies neutralized, all following the guidance of a monarch who no longer breathed. Fear and awe intertwined, for if a king could act from beyond the grave, what power remained to those who still drew breath? Counselors became cautious to the point of paralysis, peasants whispered of curses, and neighboring realms reconsidered diplomacy, wary of a sovereign whose influence transcended mortality. Even centuries later, the story endures as a paradox, a ruler whose authority defied both death and ordinary limits of human perception. The king who spoke after death is a meditation on mortality, legacy, and the tenuous boundary between presence and absence. He teaches that influence is not bound to flesh, that authority can persist in the memory and obedience of others, and that the human desire for continuity can transform even the dead into agents of action. In the hush of royal chambers, in the quiet folding of letters sealed by time, one senses the lingering echo of a voice that refused to be silenced, a reminder that some rulers extend their reign not only over lands and people, but over history itself, bending the present with instructions conceived in life and delivered in the enduring shadow of death. In a grand hall of stone and gold, where tapestries depicted victories long past and candelabras cast trembling shadows across polished floors, a feast was prepared that would be remembered not for celebration, but for annihilation. The banquet hall was alive with the scent of roasted meats, spice wines, and the subtle tang of wax from hundreds of candles. Nobles laughed and toasted, musicians played lutes and flutes, and the royal family sat at the high table, their crowns catching the firelight like shards of sunlight trapped in gold. Yet beneath the grandeur, an unseen hand wove a pattern of doom, a dark design that would end the line of rulers in a single night. Guests ate with the same precision as their ancestors, lifting goblets with ceremonious grace, unaware of the peril that flowed through the cups. Within hours, the first signs of distress emerged. A noble clutched his chest, coughing violently, his skin paling beneath the warm light. Another staggered, his laughter dissolving into a strangled gasp. Panic spread as members of the family, one after another, fell into spasms and convulsions. Servants tried to intervene, only to find themselves incapacitated, stricken as suddenly as those they sought to aid. By midnight, the banquet hall had transformed from a place of revelry to a chamber of horror, the flickering candlelight reflecting pale faces frozen in agony, the air heavy with the metallic scent of blood mingled with spilled wine. What followed was a confusion that no chronicler could reconcile. The royal family perished within hours, leaving the kingdom bereft of heirs and plunged into uncertainty. Those who survived, staff, ministers, and distant relatives disappeared or were accused of complicity, creating a vacuum of authority and a tapestry of rumor. Some claimed the feast had been poisoned by political rivals. Others whispered of a curse laid upon the dynasty, the culmination of long-forgotten betrayals and wrongs. No evidence ever emerged to confirm the exact cause, and the kitchens that had once prepared delicacies now seemed haunted, echoing with the silence of absence and loss. The feast that ended a dynasty endures as a meditation on the fragility of power and the unpredictable nature of human history. It teaches that abundance can mask vulnerability, that celebration can hide treachery, and that even the most secure lineage can collapse in a single night. The hall, now in ruins, whispers of vanished lives and stolen futures. The plates, cups, and goblets lie cold and empty, monuments not to prosperity but to mortality. Among the shadows of stone and candlelight, one senses the weight of silence and the inevitability of impermanence, a chilling reminder that feasts, like kingdoms, can be devoured entirely, leaving only memory and speculation in the aftermath of catastrophe. In a fortress perched atop jagged cliffs, where fog rolled in from the sea like restless spirits, there was a prisoner whose identity was erased by decree and obscured by fear. He was brought to the dungeons as a man of influence, perhaps a traitor, perhaps merely inconvenient, yet he was never allowed to exist in the eyes of the world again. From the moment of his arrival, a mask was affixed to his face metal, unyielding, concealing every expression, hiding every line that might betray emotion or recognition. The mask became his identity, and over decades, it transformed him from a man into a shadow, a cipher whose life was known only through whispers, rattling chains, and the faint scraping of footsteps in stone corridors. He was confined to a narrow cell, barred from sunlight and human touch, sustained by food delivered through a slit in the wall, the sounds of the fortress above reaching him only as distant echoes. The mask prevented speech, laughter, and even the simple gesture of grimace or sigh. It pressed against his skin, cold as iron, unyielding as the authority that had sentenced him. Guards swore never to look him in the eyes, fearing that recognition might grant him power. Even in his imprisonment, years passed, and his presence became a haunting rhythm, the silence punctuated only by the occasional clank of keys, the subtle shifts of stone settling in the walls, the muffled sounds of life continuing outside. Records of the prisoner were sparse, almost entirely expunged. Chroniclers who wrote of the fortress noted only a man, masked and confined, for reasons unknown, leaving generations to speculate. Some believed he had been royalty, a usurper hidden from history. Others whispered of forbidden knowledge, a man who had learned truths too dangerous for the living. No one knew if he ever spoke, if he ever thought of escape, or if time had transformed him entirely into the essence of silence. The mask, which had been intended to erase identity, became a symbol of the cruelty and meticulous control wielded by those in power. To this day, the story of the prisoner, known only by a mask, endures as a meditation on identity, authority, and the ways power can suffocate not just bodies, but memory. He exists as a legend between history and imagination, a reminder that confinement is not always measured in chains, and that erasure can be absolute when combined with fear and secrecy. The mask, cold and unyielding, remains in the mind as a symbol of what is lost when humanity is reduced to shadow, voiceless, unseen, and entirely denied the world that once defined it. Across the rolling plains and jagged hills of medieval Europe, armies once assembled with banners snapping in the wind, armor glinting under a low sun, and the rhythm of drums pounding like the heartbeat of nations. Yet, among these mustering forces, there was a conflict that defied record and official recognition, of war fought in blood and shadow, remembered only in fragments, rumors, and the scars etched into the land itself. It was a war without declaration, without treaty, without the ceremonial language that gives legitimacy to battle. And yet the violence was real, the loss profound, and the silence surrounding it deliberate. As though history itself sought to erase the confrontation from collective memory, the tensions had begun quietly over disputed lands and contested titles. Borders were murky, alliances fragile, and mistrust ran as deep as rivers carving valleys. Knights and soldiers moved with precision, gathering weapons, training under banners that fluttered in cold wind. Yet no emissaries carried formal declarations. No monarch signed edicts proclaiming hostilities. When the first skirmishes erupted, ambushes in forested passes, sudden attacks on unsuspecting villages, the acts were recorded only in fragmented notes. A burned barn here, a beheaded messenger there, a vanished convoy of carts laden with grain. Civilians fled, villages were abandoned, and the countryside bore silent witness to a conflict that existed in practice, if not in law. The war escalated in shadows. Entire regiments fought under cover of darkness. Feuds enacted with intimate knowledge of rival lands. Letters between commanders hint at strategies and victories. Yet these documents were concealed or destroyed, leaving only whispers and oral testimony. Chroniclers avoided the topic. It was politically inconvenient to record a war that had no official sanction, one that might implicate the powerful in illegality or treachery. Soldiers returned, some missing limbs, some bearing horrors too obscene to recount. Their voices, hushed by fear and oath, became part of the land itself, lingering in the hollowed hills and ruined villages. To this day, the war that never officially began endures as a meditation on the fragility of record, the power of omission, and the human capacity to erase inconvenient truths. Maps show borders untouched. Archives remain silent. Yet the earth remembers the trenches, charred homes, and skeletons buried in unmarked graves speak of the conflict that official history denies. It is a lesson that history is not solely what is documented, but also what is deliberately hidden. In the wind through empty fields and the shadowed forests, one can feel the echo of battles fought in silence, a reminder that some wars leave no signature, but the indelible mark of human suffering, carried in memory, myth, and the unquiet earth itself. In a scriptorium lit by flickering candles, where the scent of ink and parchment mingled with the chill of stone walls, a medieval chronicler labored over the recording of history. His quill scratched tirelessly, tracing the rise and fall of kingdoms, the deeds of kings, the quiet tragedies of peasants, and the dark, lingering shadows of betrayals that stretched across generations. The manuscript he produced was meticulous, alive with observation, yet poised on the precipice of revelation, for the final pages promise an account of calamity, upheaval, and events that would shape the course of nations. And then, without warning, the chronicle ends mid-sentence, a jagged, unfinished edge in ink, leaving the reader suspended between understanding and mystery. The scribe's disappearance is as enigmatic as the manuscript itself. Some suggest he was caught in the unfolding disaster he sought to describe, perhaps swept away by invaders, disease, or political purges. Others whisper that he vanished voluntarily, aware of a truth so dangerous it could not survive in written form, choosing to leave his work incomplete rather than risk the consequences of revelation. The sentence stops abruptly, a fragment of thought that dangles like a warning. The events to follow, the names to be revealed, the deeds to be recounted all remain cloaked in shadow. Scholars who later discovered the manuscript could only speculate about what followed. each conjecture more haunting than the last. The unfinished chronicle has become a symbol of history's fragility. It reminds us that the written record is never complete, that some stories end not with closure, but with absence, and that human knowledge is always provisional, suspended between what is preserved and what is lost. The abrupt halt in the text gives the imagination free rein. Kings overthrown, cities burned, betrayals enacted in silence, and disasters that reshape the world, all hidden beyond the pale of the scribe's quill. The void at the manuscript's edge is as compelling as the events that precede it, a deliberate or accidental invitation to wonder, fear, and speculation. Even centuries later, historians return to that mid-sentence fragment, tracing the scribe's hand across the parchment, feeling the tremor of ink frozen in anticipation, and sensing the urgency of a story that refuses completion. The chronicle that ends mid-sentence is a meditation on the impermanence of human effort, the inevitability of mystery, and the haunting awareness that time itself can erase endings. It teaches that some histories will never be fully known, that some voices are forever cut off, and that the absence of closure can echo as profoundly as any documented truth. In the empty margins, one feels the pulse of unfinished lives, the weight of unrecorded calamities, and the relentless whisper of history's eternal, unresolved questions.